Good morning. I'm Mike Dione, Managing Director of the Americas at Refinitiv. I'd like to welcome you to Refinitiv's Antitrust and Technology webinar series. In these discussions, our partners at Reuters Breaking Views will offer data-driven insights into the critical issues shaping the economy and the financial markets. Today, we'll focus on the topic of antitrust issues in the technology industry, which lately has seen the kind of negative criticism once reserved for oil and coal companies. Many of you likely saw the notes coming out of the House of Representatives antitrust uses of market power at Google, Facebook, Apple, and Amazon. The criticism essentially being with the they should both control and compete in related businesses. Refinitiv's World Check researchers are monitoring these and other issues in the tech sector. At this time, I'm happy to introduce our moderators, Rob Cox, global editor of Reuters Breaking Views, and Silicon Valley columnist Gina Chan. They're going to share their views on how antitrust issues in the technology sector are playing out and lead what should be an exciting discussion. Rob, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks, everybody, for tuning in. We have got the best timing ever. So we're having a conversation about breaking up technology companies on a day after the House of Representatives in the U.S. put forward a plan to do just that. So let me just quickly go through our speakers. We have Bill Baer, who's a former Assistant Attorney General of the Antitrust Division of the U.S. Justice Department, and he's coming to us from Bethesda, Maryland. Hello, Bill. Great to see you. Matt Shears is the president of the Computer and Communications Industry Association. He's coming to us from D.C. And we have Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal from the House of Representatives, of course, and coming to us from Seattle. Thank you very much, Congresswoman. It's great to see you. I think and then Gina, you're in Palo Alto, of course, dodging the forest fires and the smoke there. But let's just, before I hand it over to Gina, who put this panel together, I just think, look, Congresswoman, we've got you here, and thank you so much for putting this. I really appreciate the timing. Yesterday, a panel in the House released a report detailing what it called anti-competitive behavior by Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Alphabet's Google. Why don't you give us a kind of a quick précis on what this means and how we should be viewing this and where we're going with it?
Yes, well, thank you so much for having me on the panel. And as I said, we delivered the report just for you with this timing. So I'm glad that I'm able to talk about it. This has been a year-long investigation by the Subcommittee on Antitrust within the House Judiciary Committee. I sit on that committee. It's actually about 16-month investigation, if we're completely accurate. We were able to get tens of thousands of documents from each of the four major tech platforms, Apple, Amazon, Google, and Facebook. And we conducted numerous hearing briefings, as well as individual interviews, some with people who didn't want to be public because they feared retaliation from these platforms. But suffice it to say that this is the first major antitrust investigation that Congress has really undertaken in decades. And I think the big takeaway from this report is 400 pages. So there's a lot in it, and there's a lot of different pieces to it that I hope we can get into today in some way, shape, or form. But the big takeaway is that self-regulation doesn't work. This is obviously focused on big tech. That self-regulation is coming at the expense of our communities, our small businesses, and ultimately at the expense of innovation, free press, consumers, and competition. So the thrust of the report is that we need to, in Congress, reassert our power as Congress. And the report sort of lays out what I think of as a roadmap. It's a factually based roadmap that comes out of our 16-month investigation. And really, we're talking about reining in anti-competitive behavior, helping to prevent monopolistic practices that hurt small businesses and consumers, and at the end of the day, helping innovation and competition to thrive. There are so many pieces to the report, but let me just pull out a couple that I have been particularly interested in through my questioning on the various panels. Bill was on a hearing that we had last week on one of the things I think was important, spoke to this. But the big recommendations, I think, are, first of all, there is a recommendation for structural separation. This is the restricting of lines of business so that a platform isn't competing with others on the other competitors on their own platform and, say, misappropriating data, getting unfair market intelligence, and then using that as leverage to lock in users or businesses and require things of those businesses in order to compete on that dominant platform, without which that business or user could not be successful or thrive. And there are lots of pieces to that, including cross-subsidization of losses. One of the things that comes up is Amazon can undercut, the price of diapers for quite some time and cross-subsidize that with other lines of business in order to drive up competition. The second one I would call attention to, and this is the one I asked Mr. Baer and Zephyr Teachout during our hearing last week, was around this presumptive ban on future acquisitions. The tech field is so important to the country. It moves so quickly. And I think that it has been difficult sometimes, even for mergers that have gone through some sort of a investigation process from the FTC, being approved. I think it's been difficult to see what the effect of that merger or acquisition would be on the overall dominance of the acquiring platform. And so there is a suggestion in this report to have a presumptive ban on future acquisitions, which doesn't mean it couldn't happen. It just means that the burden of proof actually then is on the platform to show why it would not hinder competition. The third is around strengthening antitrust laws and reasserting core anti-monopoly goals and clarifying that the harms are broad and not just price. Now, this is important because we did hear a lot of testimony throughout the investigation with some people saying, look, the current antitrust laws are broad enough as they are written, but they have been interpreted by the courts, by the Supreme Court, and also by enforcers as being very narrow. And so whatever you believe here, I think there is a real role for Congress to play to strengthen those antitrust laws and clarify that the harms are not just price and that the core goals here are about anti-monopoly. And then, of course, there's addressing monopolization law and just prohibiting abuses of dominance. So there's a bit of a roadmap. There's a lot of smaller pieces, things I didn't mention in this report, but I do think it offers a very strong roadmap towards what we need to do. And it is a very important priority on a bipartisan basis, I would say, for our committee to continue to take up and for Congress to continue to take up. And hopefully people will have a chance to read the whole report, as long as it is, because I think it has very, very informative facts in there, including emails and the way in which this whole field was seen and the way in which competition was seen and the way in which certain strategies like copy, acquire, kill were sort of envisioned and then carried out.
Great. Thank you for that overview. Matt, I'm guessing you were not a fan of some of the things in this report. Your organization represents some of the companies mentioned in there, and some of the recommendations are quite momentous. We're talking about structural changes, separation of business lines. Where do you come down on this, especially when the industry has been trying to argue that they're American success stories, that they provide jobs, and a lot of ways to rein them in would actually hurt the opportunities that they present to workers?
That's right. Yeah, thanks very much for having me on the program today. Yeah, it's glad to be here. So I appreciate the efforts by the committee to study the digital sector. I appreciate them having me as a witness early on in the process. I think this is very critical. It's important to understand digital, as digital has become an increasingly important part of the U.S. economy. But coming from an association, as you said, that represents leading tech companies, I understand, acknowledge, fully accept that very successful American businesses are going to receive additional scrutiny. But from our perspective, as an association that fought monopolistic conduct by AT&T and then IBM and then Microsoft from the 70s through the 2000s, the most important question you've got to ask is, what's the impact on consumers? Antitrust is too important to be converted into an all-purpose multi-tool for industrial policy. And we need to look at the impact on consumers. And aside from some conclusory language about consumer choice, which frankly abounds today on the internet where competition's a click away, we see a focus on the government deciding the size and structure of successful businesses, potentially having bureaucrats deciding whether or not a platform can launch new products. That's not a consumer focus. That's a command economy. If you look at our current policy, I'd say that the proof is in the pudding. The GDP and productivity of the tech sector is growing multiple times faster than the rest of the US economy. That sector outperforms the rest of the US economy on factors like price decreases, where many products are free to the consumer, on job growth, on wages, and on research and development investment. On all of those metrics, I think our current policy is working quite well.
Well, Bill, I wanted to turn to you and your reaction to the report. You are not only head of the antitrust division at the Justice Department, you're also, I think, the only person to also head the Competition Bureau at the Federal Trade Commission. So you've seen it from all sides, from an enforcement agency point of view. Do the recommendations in the report, are these things that would help these agencies better review mergers and anti-competitive behavior? Are there things that you thought were missing? How would you rate the findings of the report?
First of all, your introduction raises the question of whether I'm part of the problem or part of the solution. But that aside, for the moment, I think this report did an extraordinary job. And John Paul talked about, that maybe underplayed the degree to which so much of the investigation report was actually represented a bipartisan consent. Most of the news stories are talking about some of the remedies proposed in the majority report are not supported by. But the fact is, there was broad agreement in the among the minority led by Congressman Buck that, in fact, under-enforcing that the courts have gotten increasingly cautious, increasingly worried about getting it wrong. And so the original intent that Congresswoman Jayapal talked about, both with respect to monopolistic conduct and with respect to acquisition by big firms, dominant firms, of nascent competitors. And, Matt raises the issue about whether, at the end of the day, these behaviors, acquisition strategies, actually harm consumers. I don't think there's any doubt that they do harm consumers. Facebook bought Instagram and WhatsApp. These firms have the potential, not the guarantee, but the potential actually to provide alternative platforms to Facebook. That potential.
Hey, Bill, your sound is coming in and out. I just think you may need to just speak more clearly to your microphone. Sorry to interrupt you, but it was, you were going in and out.
Maybe just I'm not very eloquent, but let's try. How am I doing now?
No, it's not that. Good. Maybe if you just don't move, I'm not sure.
I speak with my hands and my body, but let me keep trying.
That's better.
The point is that there is, I think, consumer harm. And I was talking about Facebook's acquisition of Instagram. Would be alternative platforms potentially able to compete with some of the services Facebook provided. Amazon acquisition of companies that were offering competing products on its platform eliminated, Diapers.com is a great example, folks who actually were in the market competing against Amazon. There is, as a result of the dominance of these firms, a diminution in the competition that consumers get on a day-to-day basis. That is a problem.
Well, so I wanted to get further into this issue about consumers. Congresswoman Jayapal, you, as you said, you're in Seattle. You represent an area with a lot of Amazon workers in addition to the headquarters. The traditional standard for antitrust law in terms of trying to gauge abuses has been the consumer welfare standard, which a lot of times has really focused on price. And a lot of times for Amazon, at least with consumers, we've benefited from cheaper products. Amazon now has their own private label. They're often cheaper than some of the alternatives on their platform. How do you sort of balance consumer needs and the benefits that they may receive from some of these platforms like Facebook that are free versus some of the harms that they also cause? And especially for you, representing a lot of Amazon constituents, the balance that you strike yourself in terms of, obviously wanting to represent their views, but also having the concerns that you have in mind.
Well, I think, first of all, I'm so proud to represent the 7th District. We're one of the most innovative, creative districts in the country. We're so proud of all our tech companies that are here and our small businesses. We're proud that Amazon started here. And I think that there's nothing here that is about the workers not doing tremendous work, or even the companies not providing benefit. That's never been what the argument is about. And I think you can look at Microsoft, and Microsoft is headquartered just outside of my district, but I have a huge number of Microsoft workers that live in the district. And you can look at Microsoft and the antitrust laws that forced Microsoft to really take on a whole different culture, change their ways of business. And I know that some of the top leaders at Microsoft would argue that is actually what helped to lay the groundwork for additional tech companies to be born here and across the country, of course, and to have the opportunity to compete. So I don't think we should confuse scale and dominance. I think those are two different pieces, and they need to be looked at. We're not saying, at the end of the day, we're not saying that there's nothing wrong with operating at a mass scale or with being successful. My state has frequently been named as one of the best places to do business for both large and small businesses. And we've seen businesses in sectors from aerospace to retail to tech flourish here. So I think that's a very important point. I think on the consumer welfare standard, the reality is through this investigation, we did a lot of deep dives into this question. It's extremely narrow and I think deceptively named because it purports to intervene with monopolies only when they threaten the welfare of consumers. But in practice, what that has meant is that the courts intervened with monopolies extremely infrequently. And I'm sorry that Bill's audio was going in and out so much because he talks about this very powerfully. And it has meant that mega mergers have gone through in a variety of industries, and it's allowed the concerns of the consumer, like labor standards, climate concerns, other things, to just sort of be left out. It really hasn't evolved to match the reality of these tech companies where the consumers or the customers that they're concerned with are not their end users, but the advertiser eyeballs that they attract. And as a society, as a government, looking out for the concerns of those users, actually, to me, that means looking out for public welfare. That's privacy concerns, it's misinformation concerns, it's cybersecurity concerns. And so I think that that is a very important part of this investigation. And I will just say, I'm very proud to be the member of Congress that's received the most votes, actual votes, of any member of Congress across the country. There are a lot of workers in the tech field who also see this dominance. They love the companies they work for, but I've been very actively engaged with my constituents on these issues. And I can tell you from our newspapers who see the threats to the free press and independent press, to consumers who recognize that the loss of mom and pop shops that give them choices, and the ways in which they're steered towards certain things on these platforms or are forced into behavior that is not the same as the behavior that is adhered to by the platform itself when it's competing on the same line. That I have just as many people who work for these tech companies who are concerned about that. And so I feel like this has been an important engagement with the public about how antitrust laws, or the lack of enforcement and lack of clarity around antitrust, has actually hurt them as consumers and as businesses.
Well,
Can I jump in here? One question about, just to follow up a little bit on that, which is, so broaden it. I'm coming to you from Zurich, Switzerland, not quite the European Union, but it is close. And, there is a sense that the European Commission has been a lot tougher on big tech companies than have United States regulators. And in a sense, there's sort of a joke here that like the Europeans are not necessarily innovators at tech, but they certainly are at tech regulation. I mean, of course, and when you look at the stock prices, I mean, the 5 companies that we mentioned, or the 4 or 5 companies we mentioned, this Amazon, Google, Facebook, I mean, Apple, we're talking about a $5 trillion of market valuation, which is, I think the biggest here in Europe would be Spotify at 30 or 40. I mean, is this because America has way too much sort of conflict at stake? I mean, going back to this question about, I understand, Congresswoman, that many of your constituents who work for Amazon also want the place to be regulated better, perhaps. But, is this just America catching up too slowly?
I mean, I think it's a couple things. I think, fewer big tech companies in Europe also means that the European Commission is not dealing with the big tech lobby that we are. If you look at the amount of money that has been put into lobbying Congress from tech companies, and let's be clear, these are 4 very smart guys who control an enormous amount of our economy, the decisions that are made about how people interact in their day-to-day lives. And I think that is a problem that the European Commission has not had to deal with in the same way, and so can therefore be much clearer about their mission, which is to protect people and to protect their democracy. We are very lucky, and during the course of the investigation, we did have the ability to study the impacts of the laws that are passed in Europe, and also to speak with some people from the Commission, just to see what they were doing and how they did in protecting people. And I think that was very helpful for sort of giving us the push that we needed to say, look, we can do better. And there's also some very valuable investigation, as you know, that was started in Europe that's directly relevant to our constituents in the US. And, just for example, in hearings, I've repeatedly asked Amazon's representatives, including Jeff Bezos, about Amazon's unfair use of non-public individual seller data. And the European Commission has been investigating that same question. And what they discover is completely relevant to the questions that I've been raising here.
And Matt, I just wanted to get your view on that. How much, there must be a lot of, I mean, you're essentially a lobbyist for the industry. You must also be putting lots of money into Europe, or is that what the Congresswoman is saying correct? You just have so much more firepower to fight this in Washington, and that's why nothing's happened so far in terms of regulation.
Right. It's important to recognize that European law and American law on competition matters have some overlap, but there is a considerable amount of difference. And so for that reason alone, we might expect different outcomes. in Europe, it's not uncommon that driving a weak competitor out of business could lead to antitrust investigations. Whereas in the United States, provided that's the result of lawful competition on the merits, we see that as survival of the fittest. That's why we have a far more competitive tech sector here in the United States. And to the extent that Europe is a worldwide leader, it's a leader in regulation, but regulators aren't launching new products. They're not giving consumers new innovation. So again, we got to come back and say, as I said previously, the question we got to ask is, what's good for consumers? We want companies slugging it out and fighting hard in the marketplace. That's when consumers win. It's when companies start pulling their punches against one another, when they don't fight that hard, that we see prices stagnate or increase, that innovation declines. Right? We're not seeing any of that here because we have a bunch of companies that compete among each other and compete with other parts of the economy very aggressively, that we've seen high rates of innovation and lots of new products for consumers.
Bill, there was a talk about the regulatory trends here in the past and the fact that perhaps not as much was done as it could have been. Can you talk about, from a regulatory perspective, what do you feel like people don't understand about your old job in terms of the constraints you faced? You're dealing with companies that obviously have a lot of firepower to legally challenge any decisions coming out of the DOJ or the FTC. You talked at last week's hearing about the difficulties in stopping really a dominant company from buying a nascent competitor. Really, or it has to be a significant one. So perhaps deals like Facebook and Instagram, even if you felt like there was merit there, it would have been hard to bring a case. Can you help us sort of understand what the constraints are and what tools you would like to see regulators have to address some of these issues?
Yes, thanks. And frankly, the subcommittee report, both the majority and minority reports, address that a little bit. Part of the challenge is financial. And in fact, the appropriations for antitrust enforcement have not kept pace with inflation. But even more importantly, with a dramatic increase in over the last 10, 20 years. And so the resources aren't there. These companies have every right to throw every dollar at a law enforcement activity. And no one, that's the way our system works. That's the fairness of our system. The challenge is, and Congressman Jayapal alluded to this, over the last 20, 30 years, as the Chicago school only suggested that harms of competition are limited to price increases. But the courts themselves have not only adopted that very narrow framework, but they've also effectively raised the standard of proof so that in order to challenge an acquisition or monopolistic behavior, you almost have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that there's a problem out there. So it's that combination of a very narrow view of what constitutes bad conduct and a standard of proof, a reluctance to do anything that could be as over enforcement. Makes it very hard for the government to prevail, private plaintiffs to prevail. One example, and the example you're really alluding to, is that a dominant firm acquiring some relatively nascent competitor, the antitrust laws basically show that potential competitor is one of a very few potential competitors. And it's actually asserting some competitive pressure on the dominant firm already. It's not an antitrust law. I don't think that's consistent with the law as it was, which talked about a tendency to diminish competition in a market, but it's how the courts have interpreted it. So with some modest changes to the current statutory language, there'll be increased ability for the government to examine those acquisitions by dominant. But there will be direction to the courts to be more open to prohibiting acquisitions by dominant firms that pose a real risk to competition in the long term.
Well, so Congresswoman, I want to ask you about that aspect in terms of some of these past deals. In the report, there were some deals with Amazon and with Google, such as DoubleClick, where some of them are more than 10 years old at this point. What do you think the role should be of regulatory agencies to examine these kinds of older deals, and what can they really be expected to do? The FTC's is examining the Facebook, Instagram deal. We're going to see about what the Justice Department does in its expected Google lawsuit that does involve the DoubleClick acquisition. You know, some of these companies are saying, well, how are we supposed to grow and function when we do these deals and then maybe 10 years later, you know, an agency comes and wants to undo it, and that creates an environment of uncertainty in which businesses find it difficult to operate?
Well, I mean, the reality is that hindsight is 2020, right? I mean, all legislation in some way is about exactly what you said, recognizing that there are certain harms being created. We constantly go back and redo laws that we created initially, and then we find that they don't quite, you know, meet the mark, and we have to do more. So I don't think that, I think that is just the nature of democracy and legislating. And I think that at the end of the day, what we are saying is we want innovation to thrive. We want competition to thrive. We want consumers to have choices. And one of the things that was really interesting to me about this antitrust investigation, unlike many other things that we work on sometimes, is that you really don't need to explain the relevance of this investigation to the general public. You might have to explain what antitrust is. And a lot of times in my questions in the hearings, I focus on saying, what does this mean to the regular person, the regular mom and pop business, the regular person who's using these platforms? Because I do think antitrust sometimes sounds very intellectual, and not everybody understands it, especially when you're not talking about the context of railways, right? Infrastructure that's right there. And so I think that this is about it's about regulating these companies, saying we don't believe in self-regulation, and saying that at the end of the day, as I said to all of the tech CEOs, we want to create an environment where more Apples, more Facebooks, more Amazons, and more Googles can exist, can be born, and can thrive. So I don't think it creates uncertainty for the business. In fact, I think it's better than that, because it does allow the government to regulate many pieces of this business. Right now, I mean, Representative Cicilline and I wrote a letter to Facebook some weeks ago about needing to do more on controlling misinformation, disinformation, and hate speech. I'm pleased that Facebook has now taken more aggressive action towards QAnon, has, you know, taken down a tweet from the president, though I'm sure that will increase the calls of unfair political bias. But we just have to recognize we can't leave everything to four men who control what happens around our elections, our democracy, and our competition and innovation in this country. That's just not, that's untenable. So it's good that there's been so much bipartisan support for the investigation, and I think there will be going forward as well.
Well, so you talked about how this relates to regular people, and you mentioned the elections, which, God help us, is just a month away, or less than a month away, I should say now. How do you think antitrust policy, when it comes to these big tech firms, fits into the democratic economic agenda? You asked an interesting question last week at the hearing about how competitive behavior has affected sort of racial economic justice, income inequality. How do you relate this back so that the average person does understand how this affects them?
Well, that's why I asked that question, because I think that there are sort of the easy things that you see right away, and then there are things that perhaps are a little bit harder to assess. What happens when you stifle mom and pops or you put undue restrictions on participating in these platforms? What does it do to Black and Brown communities? This is really, we talked a lot in last week's hearing about these platforms as critical infrastructure. And so what does that mean around advertising on these critical infrastructure platforms? What does it mean about access? And I think that that is a very important concept, because if you look at, particularly the effects on low-income people, Black and Brown and Indigenous people, working people, you see this in numerous ways. I had a question when we were questioning the CEOs. I asked Mr. Zuckerberg if Facebook was too big to care. There was an ad boycott that had, and this isn't a direct, this was not directly in the scope of our antitrust investigation as it was set up. But the idea that a company could say, well, we know everyone's going to have to come back, all the folks who are advertising with us, they might pull out for a little while, but we know they're going to have to come back because we're too big. They can't possibly be successful without advertising on our platform. That should cause deep concern for everyone. And so we are constantly trying to explain, what is seen as perhaps one set of impacts to be much broader than that, and to show the reality of how it has affected our democracy, income equality or income inequality, wealth consolidation, power consolidation. All those things are very important byproducts, if you will, or serious harms of when we have too much consolidation and not enough competition.
So, Matt, I wanted to turn to you. You're hearing all of these criticisms of the industry. There is one of the few bipartisan consensus in Washington, as Congressman Jayapal mentioned, is sort of honing in on the problems of these big tech firms. You've seen the Republicans, though, come at it from a bit of a different angle, with throwing in anti-conservative bias in terms of their complaints. We saw that in the Republican report that came with the House Majority Subcommittee report on big tech. Bill Barr, the Attorney General, has also talked about that being a problem, and one in which antitrust law could actually be used to address anti-conservative bias and sort of perceived censorship of those kinds of views. How does your organization, how does the industry fight back when you're sort of getting it from both sides and the politics is sort of not in your favor on either side of the aisle?
I think, yeah, you point out that there seems to be some consensus there's a problem, but zero consensus on what the nature of the problem is, right? So to answer the question directly, there is zero evidence of systematic political bias in content moderation, decisions about whether or not to remove or otherwise manage improper content. But even if there were, that's not an antitrust issue. I think this is yet another example of some members of the subcommittee having taken up the hammer of antitrust and looking at everything like it's a nail. I think on this conservative bias claim, we should be very concerned that the government is threatening companies to try and make them bias content decisions in its favor. That's not how democracies behave. That's China and Russia and Venezuela. So, I mean, my view here would be if you don't like a social media company's content moderation decisions, then perhaps try a competing offering, right? So we see a lot of conservatives going to Parler and Gab. We see others going to Snapchat and TikTok and WeChat and Discord. And so consumers have lots of options here. The competition's just a few clicks away. I do, let me take one though, to respond. You talked a little bit about consolidation in the economy. And I agree, there is evidence that there has been consolidation in parts of the US economy, and that's an issue that merits study. But if you actually look at what's happening in the tech sector, we see prices going down, we see products that are often free to the consumer, we see wages increasing, we see job growth, we see lots of investment in R&D. Right? That's not how consolidating uncompetitive industries behave. So I think maybe we do have problems that we need to look at across the US economy, but they manifest the least on this metric in the tech sector.
So you brought up TikTok and WeChat as some of the options. We've seen the executive order from President Trump forcing ByteDance, a Chinese owner of TikTok, to divest of their US assets, possibly sell a minority stake to Oracle. We'll see where all of that goes. It's been pretty messy. But Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook has also been trying to push this argument about if you go after American big tech firms, that's only going to help these Chinese companies. When you talk about that, do you feel like that message has really resonated with policymakers? Because it seems like a lot of people are sort of taking that more as an excuse as opposed to a legitimate concern.
Yeah, so look, I think this is a great question, and it's absolutely a question that policymakers need to manage. On the one hand, we don't want to tear down all these amazing American success stories only to find they're being replaced by Chinese or other foreign success stories, right? On the other hand, that doesn't mean that anybody should get a free pass from regulatory compliance. And that's why I keep going back to talking about looking at consumers' welfare, right? How are consumers benefiting from what's going on in the marketplace from these developments, right? Are we seeing more innovation? Are we seeing lower prices, higher quality? Those are the metrics that we should use to make these decisions.
And Congressman Jayapal, I wanted to get your thoughts about this argument of Chinese competitors, particularly because, again, since you have Amazon in your backyard, they have Alibaba coming at them. They're pitching to American small businesses to sell to Chinese consumers on their platform. What do you make of that argument that, if you go after an Amazon or a Facebook, that's just going to help their Chinese competitors on the other side?
I just think it's a real stretch. If you broke up one of these massive companies, I'm sorry to be so blunt, but I think if you were to, implement structural separation or, break up one of these massive companies, each of their separate parts would still provide jobs. There would be lots of space for other entrants to the field to make different decisions about their business model or their corporate culture, the options that are available to consumers with regards to privacy and commodification of attention. If you just imagine an Instagram that can make independent decisions from Facebook based on the decisions of a different set of investors and corporate officers about what kinds of information related to the election would be available on the platform. Or, imagine Amazon's marketplace spun off from the company's manufacturing and product sales. That would open up a lot of space for other businesses on the platform, and there would be much less of an incentive for the platform to spy on or commandeer the data of companies that are selling on that platform if it were no longer selling on its own platform. Or imagine apps, the App Store for Apple and the app development work that it does. If those two things were separated, what an amazing invitation for energetic tech developers to keep innovating and developing without fear of being shut down or taxed into oblivion, just for the privilege of entering the marketplace. I just don't think that at the end of the day, setting fair rules for everyone is a punishment, unless you are assuming that these companies can only succeed and persist by having these drastic asymmetries of information and controlling basic access to platforms and marketplaces. I think better of the companies we've been investigating. I think that they can succeed. I think they can thrive with regulation. I think Microsoft is a prime example. And like I said, I talk to Brad Smith regularly about that transition that Microsoft went through. And it was a transition of culture as well as of complying with regulation. Those two things are deeply intertwined. And I really believe that he would say, and he has said publicly, that Microsoft is a better company for having had to go through that process. And frankly, our region is better for it, and the tech sector is better for it.
Well, so you talked about the separation of some of these companies, and I want to make sure we have some time for questions. So I want to ask you and ask the other panelists, and I'm sorry, Bill, the sound is cutting in and out, so I'm going to unfortunately have to skip you on this one. But Congressman, I want to ask you, with the election coming up, we're waiting to see what happens not only with the White House, but also the makeup of Congress. A lot of the recommendations in the report would require some sort of congressional action. Where do you think we go from here? I mean, has the mood around these big tech companies, even with some of the differences of opinions of how to address them, do you think it's come to a head enough that we will expect something to happen perhaps in 2021? Or do you feel like, the way things work in Congress, it's more sort of geared towards sometimes things not happening and things getting bogged down, that the tech companies can just sort of buy their time?
Well, obviously, we have a lot of big issues to address in this country. 212,000 deaths in America, over 7 million cases of COVID. And so that is obviously going to be a number one priority if we have a new administration. And so there are certainly things that will take precedence over this immediately. But I do think, and I just want to commend, Representative Buck and Representative Armstrong and some of the other Republicans on this committee. It was just really great to see the bipartisan support. And you'll notice that Representative Buck said, I agree with 330 pages of the report. We may have some differences on exactly which way to go forward, but I really do believe that there's a lot of agreement around tackling this issue. And there will be things that are easier to do because they are bipartisan. But that doesn't mean that we're not also going to take on and make the case for some of the things that may be harder. We do have to be precise about what we want to do. The devil is always in the detail with legislation. So I'm really looking forward to working with my Republican colleagues. And I do think it'll be a priority for legislation in the next Congress. It was part of the Democrats for the People platform 4 years ago, actually, back in 2017. It was one of the planks of the For the People platform. So it's been on our agenda for a while. But I think this investigation and the way that Chairman Cicilline conducted it in a bipartisan way is really helpful to getting the buy-in for moving real legislation that can pass through.
And Matt, what about you? What's the industry expecting now that you've seen the results of this report, some of the initial reaction to it? I know a lot obviously depends on what happens in November, but are you guys sort of gearing up for a big fight possibly next year?
Right. Thanks, Gina. So I think I agree with the Congresswoman on a number of things, in fact. I know we're certainly focusing on our disagreements here, but there's lots of points of common agreement. And one of them certainly is that the most important priority for our country right now is responding to the public health crisis, and then responding to the economic crisis that has fallen out of that crisis. And to that end, the industry has been making a lot of contributions, and frankly, digital services have played a critical role in helping us sort of pivot to a virtual, remote kind of business and office workplace. But beyond that, I think there are some points of common agreement about policy as well. The report talks about privacy issues, and while privacy is not an antitrust matter. And certainly the nature of a product and the quality of a product might be a metric around which we assess consumer welfare. Despite not being an antitrust issue, I think privacy is an issue where there's a lot of consensus. The business community has been pushing for federal legislation, have been putting forward baseline privacy rules for a long time now. And because of disagreements on some technical issues, it hasn't gotten across the finish line. But we think there's a lot of progress that can be made providing baseline federal privacy protections for consumers that give meaningful choice and transparency, empowering the FTC with resources to protect privacy is all important. But again, that's not a privacy issue. I'm sorry, an antitrust issue. When it comes to these antitrust questions, and particularly the proposals that are put forward in the report, again, policymakers have to decide, do we want to continue with a policy that focuses on advancing consumers' interests, which looks at prices and quality and innovation, under which the US tech sector has become the envy of the world, or do we want governments and regulators in the position of deciding the structure of companies, deciding how many products a company can launch, and basically micromanaging the affairs of one of America's most innovative industries? I think the answer to that question is no, that's not what we want.
Gina, shall I jump into a couple of questions? Or go ahead, Bill, if mic is working.
I'm trying to get into this in a little more constructive way. I think two quick points. One is Matt suggested that consumers get the benefit a lot of these platform output without paying a price. They don't pay a monetary price to search on Google or to post on Facebook. They pay a price in terms of their personal data that is uploaded and through artificial intelligence and be used for a whole variety of purposes. So there is a real cost. One of the things that is talked about in the report is that in order to provide consumers with alternatives to a dominant platform, we may need to set some prospective rules about interoperability, for example, the ability for me to take my data away from a platform that I don't think is behaving right, that is violating my privacy, and to another platform. So one of the potential solutions is not pure antitrust, but it's setting up some prospective rules of the road.
Great. Let me just go. We've got a few questions coming in from folks here. I'll give you, they're in no particular order. One is, well, I sort of sent this to you, Congresswoman. If you look at Amazon and others, but let's focus on Amazon, a lot of the tech companies, you have seen big booms in their business as a result of lockdowns and things like that. I think Amazon stock is up 67% since before the lockdown began. To raise the question, and some people have asked the question of whether that maybe there's some windfall profits that these companies have experienced as a result of government decisions, essentially to lock down economies. I mean, this is not just a U.S. phenomenon, but I'm just curious. Back when we've had this question of windfall profits, in the oil industry, we did it, I think, after Jimmy Carter. The UK did the same when there was a boom in the North Sea. Oil. I mean, is it fair that companies like Amazon have benefited to such a degree as a result of government decisions to essentially close economies or shut things down?
Well, I think there's two pieces to that. One is, what are the companies required to provide to the workers who are driving those profits? We sometimes talk about corporations as if they're not powered by workers. When workers do better, companies do better. When companies do better, workers should do better. That is not the case. And over the last several decades, we've seen $4.5 trillion of income transferred from the 95% of the population to the top 5%. This is a new study that just came out by the Rand Corporation. And so I think there's a lot of things in your question that have to do with tax structures, that have to do with regulations of worker standards and wages. When Amazon is making so much money, and yet we're not able to provide continuing premium pay for workers. We're not, it took a long time to get that on the books, and then it was sort of stopped. And the question is, what is the responsibility of those tech companies that are providing very important services during this time of crisis to also make sure that the benefits of those profits get transferred to the workers who are actually doing the work? And that has been a frustration, frankly, because we've seen that during COVID, we have only exacerbated income and wealth inequality in this country. The top 5% of the country, 1 to 5% of the country is doing great. They can get whatever they need whenever they need it. But you've seen the tremendous strains on frontline workers who, on Black and Brown and Indigenous people who make up a big part of the frontline community, who can't even get a test, much less pay their mortgage. So this is a big issue. It's not just an antitrust issue, but I think it gets to the question of what kind of a country do we want to be? And do we want to reward workers with wages and benefits and healthcare and living standards that allow them to have a decent life and to make the same kinds of choices that we make when we're able to stay at home and work from home? Most of these frontline workers cannot do that. And they are putting themselves and their families at tremendous risk, because the choice is, do I go to work and get a paycheck, or do I stay home? And it's a tremendous burden for many of the workers that are on the front lines of a company like Amazon.
Yeah. I want to ask you, Matt, a question as well that's come up, which is was there not a compromise between, let's say, the bill that the Judicial Committee in the House has put forward, which is, arguably quite extreme, and something like the GDPR, the privacy acts that were enacted by the European Union? I mean, why hasn't your industry, why hasn't the tech industry embraced that? Because it has certainly not killed the tech industry in Europe, but it has at least answered some of this question, which the Congresswoman brought up, of the failure of self-regulation.
Well, so there's a lot there. First of all, current law is not self-regulation, right? The scope and scale of federal laws and federal regulations is extraordinary, and industry complies with those existing rules. So self-regulation isn't really on the table. That's not what anybody's talking about. But you're talking about GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, which is a privacy regulation. In U.S. antitrust law. So there's a bit of apples and oranges to begin with.
Sure.
But sort of taking that as given, it is said by many who've studied the marketplace that after Europe enacted the GDPR regulations, it actually had the effect of disadvantaging small businesses in Europe and strengthening some of the larger players, which include a lot of American companies that export into Europe. And so they inadvertently kneecapped their own industry to the advantage of US businesses. And so you might say, well, that's good for US exports. But what we really want to do is have an open and free marketplace where everyone can compete and no companies are surrounded by a regulatory moat. And I think that's very much what happened in Europe. So I would say that GDPR, although it represents critical priorities and it embraces the importance of privacy, the means by which Europe went around it was not well executed, right? But as I said earlier, there is still a lot of interest in the business community and within the tech sector to get meaningful privacy regulation here in the United States. When we talk about that in competition law, at the end of the day, those are, as I said, sort of apples and oranges issues.
Right.
Rob, I just want to correct one thing, just for the record, if I could. What we've done in the Judiciary Antitrust Committee is is we have not put forward legislation. There is no bill, there is no legislation. It's a report with a set of recommendations, and now we need to come up with what the legislation is. You mentioned legislation from the committee, and I just wanted everybody to be clear that there is no legislation. We are at the beginning of that legislative process in a way, with the facts of the report. And I do think that to say that these companies haven't been self-regulating is wishful thinking. They have been self-regulating on any number of fronts, with tremendous respect to my friend from the tech sector. So I think we should just be clear that now we will start the process of figuring out what the legislation looks like.
Well, that will be fun to watch.
Yes. Well, and we will definitely all be watching for those next steps. I want to thank you to the panelists, especially for such a timely discussion after this report. And I will hand it over to Mike.
Thank you, Gina, Rob, and panelists. That was a rich and exceptionally timely discussion. Given the importance of the tech sector to the U.S. economy, these issues are likely to dominate the news for some time and be a major concern for investors around the world. That's what makes Breaking Views more important than ever. Breaking Views reports the news as it develops and provides financial insight and analysis in real time, much faster than the mainstream media. Refinitiv customers following the presidential race and politics in general can use the U.S. Poll app and Icon and Workspace to access Breaking Views. From the news, you can launch into deep workflow-based analysis that will help drive strategic decision-making. We encourage you to tune in for the next webcast. It takes place on October 14th, and we'll look at the economy from a number of angles. We'll analyze issues such as infrastructure, fiscal policy, healthcare spending, the growing wealth gap, and the effect of the coronavirus on the economy, and what the Fed can do about it. Until then, look for an up-to-the-minute news and analysis from Reuters and Breaking Views in either Icon or Workspace. Thanks again to Rob and the panelists for their participation today. Please send your feedback on this session by completing our survey. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.